Welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today, we are going to look at a module that is titled Capitalism, Origins, Development, Social System and Human Alienation. Karl Marx is very well known as a scholar who has used a materialist understanding of the evolution of human society. What is interesting is the fact that he looks at how capitalism creates two major classes that are antagonistic in their interests. One, the bourgeoisie, that is the capitalist class, the owners, and the other, the laboring class or the proletariat. This tension between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat create new kinds of relations and power relations between these two groups of people. How does capitalism result in alienation is one of the things we will be learning in this particular module on Karl Marx. In today's society, we cannot ignore the fact that we are also part of the economic system that determines our life choices, worldviews, and cultural and social aspirations. Every day of our life is invested in accumulation of money, goods, and services which involve movement of money, labor, etc. These things that we are doing helps one way or the another to help form part of society's movement of capitalism. Globalization is not new, but the present form of globalization is reinforcing inequalities and capital accumulation. Today, labor, money, and knowledge are easily transferable globally. Cities such as New York, London, Brussels, Tokyo, Manila, Mumbai, Paris, and the rest of the major cities are now well known as global cities. These cities offer all kinds of services and facilities to its citizens and the migrant global citizenry. In the process, it caters to those individuals who are recognized by the state and aids in creating a system in which exploitation and pauperization of those at the margins is normalized. The capitalist system of the globalized world offers avenues for accumulation of wealth and growth of billionaires and millionaires in today's world. Until now, one could understand disparity through the binary of global north and south. Today, this division is fast eroding, and in the near future, Asia may have the highest number of billionaires. Today's capitalist systems offer a variety of services and products to its consumers. But on the other hand, a large section of humanity, especially in the third world countries, is kept on the fringes of the system. The poor become poorer and the rich become richer. It is the fact that we cannot, on this present situation, the daily wagers who work night and day in order to earn their daily needs and to survive, while billionaires on the other hand are enjoying the fruits of labor of this marginalized group. But how did human society enter this so-called era of capitalism? According to Marx, historical necessities determine the future courses of human agency. By this he means that the means and mode of production, together with the relations of production or forces of production and technology, constitute the fundamental condition for the transformation of human society from one phase into another. Thus, with the accumulation of wealth and gold from colonies, European countries set the stage for the end of feudalism and rise of a new society under the aegis of capitalism. Monarchies and royalties no longer commanded authority in this new system, which was based on the notion of rule of one class over another, that is the bourgeoisie over the proletariat. The means of production in the system henceforth are held with the capitalist class, and capitalism is a system that allows for the protection of interests of this class through and by the modern state, through its legislations, law and order institutions. In this system, the market economy decides the mode of human development. This economy not only controls the society, its culture and social fabric, but also dominates the state. The following text provides insight in the probable trajectories of the growth of capitalism in Europe and its spread elsewhere in the global north. It also examines how capitalism entails alienation of human beings from one another and also from herself. Origin until the discovery of capital. There are different ways of understanding of what capitalism is and how it was brought into existence. For Marx, he characterizes capitalism as primarily a system of market anarchy, rather a system of income and power differentials. Such anarchy engenders primarily the perceived rule of people by commodities and secondarily the rule of people by people. On the other manner, capitalism is today's definition is an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decisions, and by prices, production and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. These definitions only give us a little idea of the whole meaning, origin and development of capitalism in general. In this part of the module about capitalism, we first present the origin of capitalism in general and its development in the number of years till the present capitalism system in society. As far as we know, humankind, in discovering their uniqueness as a rational being, was able to come up with the idea of barter or exchange in the ancient period of history. Because of this, it is only a simple way of showing one's ownership of something and exchange to another thing which is necessary for their living. In the development of this exchange system, human societies came up with the idea of the market. Soon enough, monetization of the economy led to further inversion of capitalism into societal relationships. Capitalism involves generation of profit and surplus capital. One example is investing a certain amount of money in the stock market or banks, where after certain maturity the investor can gain an extra income due to interest it accrues. To fast track history of capitalism, during the 13th to 16th century, the European nations of yesteryears were growing through their colonial exploits and mercantilism and trade. Countries like Portugal and Spain, which were naval powers, captured territories in South and Central America. It was through exploitation of resources in these colonies that their economies grew at a phenomenal rate. This was later also true of Britain, France, Germany and Italy. Through imperialism and trade, European nations engaged in a new form of mercantilism. This surplus money and resources was later to be launchpad for the growth of industrial revolution in Europe. During this time also, in France, the story of Jacques Coeur gives us a whole background of the development of capitalism. He provides an astonishing example of the rapid creation of wealth through skillful investment in foreign merchandise such as cases containing elements of later capitalism, but their limited scale makes them in a certain way different. There have always been markets, and no doubt in every civilization, some individuals have been able to use markets to amass a quick fortune. As David Harvey comments, the essential character of capitalism becomes evident with an increase in scale in two quite separate contexts. One is the formation of joint stock companies in which investors pool the resources for a major commercial undertaking. The other, not evident until the Industrial Revolution, is the development of factories in which large number of workers are employed in single private companies. This was probably one such instance in Europe, just like many others that were shaping up. It was the surplus wealth and loot from colonies that allowed the merchant class initially to indulge in a new kind of entrepreneurship, that's business of production. This was just the starting point. The merchants had become powerful and popular. Some even questioned the authority of the imperial state. Over time, a new social and political order came to dominate Europe, one which overthrew feudalism, that is capitalism. Barrington Moore, in his book Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, suggests a similar path that Britain followed in this phase. It was through the notion of private property that the notion of individual and political rights also originated. 19th and 20th century development of capitalism and the critique of its nature. During the 19th and 20th century, the capitalism gradually begins to influence life worlds of the feudal society in Europe. Private property, modern state, new laws, bureaucracy, also begin to take shape as the early phase of capitalism begins to institutionalize itself. The trends and its essence change into different perspectives. As time goes on and as rapid development affects the whole world, new discoveries of technologies or going to modern age, capitalism also evolves in different ways. As time elapses, economic growth and industrial development increases in Western society, creating a huge gap between the rich and the poor. It was in this phase when pauperization of the masses and their sufferings were probably at their height and provided valid reasons for Marx to critique the system. That is Marx's economic analysis of capitalism is based on his version of the labor theory of value and includes the analysis of capitalist profit as the extraction of surplus value from the exploited proletariat. The analysis of history and economics come together in Marx's prediction of the inevitable economic breakdown of capitalism to be replaced by communism. However, Marx refused to speculate in detail about the nature of communism, arguing that it would arise through historical processes and was not the realization of a predetermined moral idea. Marx was a humanist and he therefore sought to comprehend how the capitalist system functions and what are the necessary conditions for its survival and reproduction. In attempting to do so, he seeks to demystify the invisible hand of Adam Smith through the conceptual framework of capital accumulation and thus exposes the invisible entity called surplus value. In doing so, he also raises important questions such as who contributes to this capital accumulation, and he attempts to capture the power relations in the market-led political economy in which even the state supports the capitalist interest. He witnesses the helplessness of the working class as they have not only the labor power to sell in the market. The capitalist, on the other hand, owns and controls the means of production. Thus, the labor is pauperized and used by the capitalist to generate profit in the form of accumulation of wealth. Marx has argued that the capitalist system that is based on exploitation and generation of surplus value needs to be necessarily have a social system that supports this process. He therefore suggests that the market economy creates a mirror image within the social milieu of such societies. For appropriation of surplus value, the social system must necessarily be structured that the exploitation seems natural. Thus, the nuclear family in Europe was in many ways a product of the capitalist economy. According to Engels, this was the basic unit that allowed for invisibilization of women's labor that in turn generated free or subsidized labor of men in the market. If it were not for the free labor of women who tended the family, capitalism would have collapsed. Also, women workers were paid less than their men counterparts so as to maximize profits. Social system in the society of capitalism and human alienation. Similarly, if one were to employ Marx's logic, then the whole area that constituted the social was directly affected by the market and political economy. Thus, the schooling and education system would be viewed as an auxiliary part of the capitalist economy. So can the state and society relationships, marriage as a social institution, law, governance, social norms and value system. David Harvey, in his book Reading Capital, 2010, examines how the system of exploitation and its ideology of domination is gradually internalized within society. It is through the state, as Louis Althusser points out, that control over the bodies and minds of the working class is achieved. The ideology of capitalism becomes the hegemonic idea and thus is uncontestable. The system of over a period of time creates a situation wherein human beings are gradually alienated from it. The process of alienation is also seen in the work of Durkheim in terms of anomie and suicide, and Weber, rationalization and bureaucracy, but in the context of modern societies and modern states. Thus, for Marx, the political economy dictates the social and the cultural together with the political within society. These institutions of culture reinforce the very ideology and structures that oppress us. Thus, Marx suggests that the only way to overcome the system is through a violent revolution which envisages the overthrow of the capitalists. According to Marx, this is not easy, as one of the first steps is to recognize the fact that working class is exploited. He argues that exploitation and pauperization is legitimated through the moral order of religion. Therefore, Marx terms religion as the opium of the masses. We can now elaborate on the concept of exploitation and alienation. In his writings, Marx begins with an analysis of the idea of commodity production. A commodity is defined as a useful external object produced for exchange on a market. Thus, two necessary conditions for commodity production are the existence of a market in which exchange can take place and a social division of labor in which different people produce different products, without which there would be no motivation for exchange. Marx suggests that commodities have both use value, a use in other words, and an exchange value, initially to be understood as the price. Use value can be understood. So Marx insists that exchange value is a puzzling phenomenon and relative exchange values need to be explained. Why does a quantity of one commodity exchange for a given quantity of another commodity? His explanation is in terms of the labor input required to produce the commodity, or rather the socially necessary labor time, which is the labor exerted at the average level of intensity and productivity for that branch of activity within the economy. Thus, the labor theory of value asserts that the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of socially necessary time required to produce it. In continuation of this argument, Marx provides a two-stage argument for the labor theory of value. The first stage is to argue that if two objects can be compared in a sense of being put on either side of an equal sign, then there must be a third thing or of identical magnitude in both of them, which they are both reducible to. As commodities can be exchanged against each other, there must, Marx argues, be a third thing that they have in common, and this motivates the second stage, which is a search for the appropriate third thing, which is labor in Marx's view, and the only possible common element. Both steps of the argument are, of course, highly contestable. According to Marx, capitalism involves the organization of exchange through the market, but this does not merely mean the exchange of commodities, but the advancement of capital through monetization, thus generating profit. The actual cost of production plus the labor power and wages together with the expropriation of the surplus value constitutes the gross profit of the capitalist. The money moves through a particular trajectory, the purchase of one set of commodities which is then transformed into other commodities, which is the command of a higher price through the use of abundant and easily available cheap labor power, which finally culminates in the generation of profit. Before Marx, Adam Smith had also attempted to comprehend how this process actually works, but resigned with the idea that there is an invisible hand that operates vis-a-vis the market that allows for the uncontrolled and ever expanding capitalist market to reproduce itself over and over again. It is here that Marx critiques Adam Smith's analysis and suggests that it is only the exploitation of cheap labor power that profits can be made. In capitalism, the owner class purchases the worker's labor power. In return, the worker is paid wages. It is this act and the one that follows that allows for surplus value to be actually generated. Once the product or commodity is manufactured, its cost is determined in the same way as the cost of any other. That is, the terms of the amount of socially necessary labor power is required to produce it. The socially necessary labor power means all factors that lead to the final manufacture of the commodity, that is, labor, cost of the raw material, time, other investment, etc. However, when the commodity is sold, it includes another component called the surplus value. What is the surplus value? According to Marx, the laboring class is only paid the value of a day's labor power, just necessary enough to keep the worker alive for the day. While working for the capitalist, the worker is paid only for the time that is required to produce that particular commodity and not for the rest of the time that is invested. Thus, for the laboring individual, she is surviving just to help create surplus profit for the capitalist owner. Let's illustrate this with an example. Suppose a particular commodity takes 4 hours to manufacture. Thus, the first 4 hours of the working day spent on producing a value equivalent to the value of the wages the worker will be paid. This is known as necessary labor. Any work the worker does above this is known as surplus labor, producing surplus value for the capitalist. Surplus value, according to Marx, is the source of all profit. In Marx's analysis, labor power is the only commodity which can produce more value than its own worth, and for this reason it is known as variable capital. Other commodities simply pass their value on to the finished commodities but do not create any extra value. They are known as constant capital. Profit then is the result of labor performed by the worker beyond the necessary to create the value of his or her wages. This is a surplus value theory of profit. It appears to follow from the analysis that as industry becomes mechanized, using more constant capital and less variable capital, the rate of profit ought to fall, for as a proportional less capital will be advanced on labor, and only labor can create value. This condition of exploitation is naturalized. The workers begin to believe that this is the way the system works and it is fair to receive the wages that can keep them alive. However, after a certain period of time, this monotony and hard life begins to take on the mental and physical health of the worker. Further, the worker who is exhausted and burnt out due to the same routine day in and day out finds leisure time only when in family. Thus, the importance of the family and women, especially in healing the workers' minds and body, becomes a necessary practice. Capitalism, in this sense, actually divides human life into two main binaries: work and leisure. Workers spend most of their lives in the first binary, that is, work in order to survive. It is through this extra labor time and at that the capitalist is able to accumulate wealth and reproduce this in many other ways. According to Marx, this creates discontent and withdrawal for the laboring poor from this system. He calls this process alienation. Marx believes that there are 4 levels at which the worker is alienated from the system. The first level is when the worker is estranged from his own labor power. The second estrangement finally leads to a point wherein the laborer is unable to associate with the work that she is doing. This means that the workers are alienated from the product of their labor. The surplus labor that they create is the basic cause of their apathy. Thus, according to Marx, the alienation of the worker in the process of manufacturing the commodity means that not only does her labor become an objective reality which has an external existence, but that it exists outside her or him, independently as something alien to her. This external objective reality possesses a power of its own which confronts the worker's aspirations and well-being. Thus, the product of labor is legally owned by someone other than the workers who produce the commodity, and that in spite of their toil, the workers are physically and mentally deprived of the fruits of labor. In the words of Marx, so much does labor's realization appear as loss of realization that the worker loses realization to the point of starving to death. So much does objectification appear as loss of the object that the worker is robbed of, the objects made necessary not only for his life but for his work. Indeed, labor itself becomes an object which he can obtain only with the greatest effort and with the most irregular interpretations. So much does appropriation of the objects appear as estrangement that the more objects the worker produces, the less he can possess, and the more he falls under the sway of his product capital. The second level of alienation that Marx refers to is the lack of control over the product that she has produced. What should be the design, whom should it be sold to, and for what price should it be sold, etc. It is actually the product and the owner that controls them. The worker has become the slave of the product. The object which labor produces, labor's product, confronts it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. The third level of alienation, according to Marx, is the objectification of the labor power and the identity that it creates. Marx is underscoring the fact that the working class can only have existence in capitalism insofar as they are workers. Being a worker comes first, being a human comes second. To quote, the height of this bondage is that it is only as a worker that he continues to maintain himself as a physical subject, unquote. The aspect of alienation follows from the first year. Here Marx considers the alienation of the workers from the productive activity. To quote, if then the product of labor is alienation, production itself must be active alienation. The alienation of activity, the activity of alienation, unquote. Here Marx argues that the kind of work and condition of work that wage workers have to accept is inimical to their essential being. This does not bring satisfaction but wears the worker down, leaving only frustration. To quote, in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker therefore only feels himself outside his work, and his work feels outside of him. He is at home when he is not working, and when he is not working, he is not at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not for the satisfaction of need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs externally. In the third instance level of alienation, Marx argues that the workers are alienated from their essential species being. By this, Marx means that the character of every species is contained in the character of its life activity, and that human species being is supposed to represent free and conscious individuality. But Marx argues that wage labor does not conform to this notion of free and conscious individuality, and hence is not truly human activity. To quote, the object of labor is therefore the objectification of man's species life, for he duplicates himself not only as in consciousness, intellectually, but also actively in reality, and therefore he contemplates himself in a world he has created. In tearing away from man the object of his production, therefore estranged labor tears from his species life his real objectivity as a member of the species, and transforms his advantage over animals into the disadvantage, that his inorganic body, nature, is taken away from him, unquote. Finally, the fourth aspect of alienation follows from the first three aspects, that is, estrangement of human from another human. In other words, instead of truly human relations between people, relationships are governed by people's roles as agents in the economic process of expansion and accumulation of value. Thus, to finally conclude, this module has looked at how humans are completely alienated from the capitalist system, in which the laboring class has nothing else to sell but its own labor. Even the sale of this labor and the rules that outline the sale of this labor is defined by the capitalist class. In this way, the worker is alienated from one's own labor, is alienated from the product that he or she creates, and is alienated from fellow human beings. Finally, the alienation is complete because the individual is completely alienated from society.